Some nights, the ocean called people by name. No one in Port Bell liked to admit it, but they had all heard it at least once. A faint voice carried over the water, soft and cold, whispering in the dark. Fishermen told themselves it was just the wind in the rigging, or the crash of waves against the rocks, but deep down they knew better. In the winter of 1802, that voice called the Redgrave sisters. No one saw them leave their cliffside house. No one heard the door open in the night. But by morning, the snow outside was marked with 2 sets of bare footprints, heading straight toward the black edge of the sea. They never came back. Some say they drowned, some say they were taken, and some, the ones who still wake in the night to the sound of the tide, whispering through their window, say the girls simply went home. Before we begin, remember, this story is based on real events from the cold coast of Maine in 1802. If you enjoy these journeys into history's dark corners, make sure you subscribe to Behind the Genius and hit the bell, so you never miss the stories that the world tried to bury. Now, let's step into the cold. Mary and Eliza Redgrave were not like other children. Pale, thin, and quiet as shadows, they moved through the village together, always together, speaking only in low murmurs. They were 13 but seemed older somehow, or maybe just stranger. Their father, Josiah Redgrave, was a man no one trusted. He had arrived in Port Bell 3 years earlier from Salem, alone with his daughters and a weather-beaten chest he never let out of his sight. The rumors began before the first week was out. His wife dead under strange circumstances, debts unpaid, trouble with the law. But Josiah was a fisherman, and in a village built on salt and fish guts, work was work. Still, people noticed things. The way Josiah kept the girls under strict rules. Never look at the sea after midnight, never speak to strangers about the tide. Never, ever step into the water on the last night of the month. The girls obeyed without question. They didn't play with the other children. They didn't go to the chapel. And sometimes, in the dead of winter when the shoreline was rimmed with jagged ice, they would walk barefoot to the cliffs and stand there for hours, staring into the black water. One evening, old Nathaniel Pike, a fisherman with more years than teeth, spotted them out there. Later, with a shaking voice, he claimed they were talking, not to each other, but to the sea. And the sea, he said, talked back. When pressed, Nathaniel muttered about something rising from the water toward them. Not a seal, not a man. Something pale with hair floating like weeds. The girls didn't scream. They smiled. By morning, Nathaniel was found drunk in the street, eyes wide open even in his sleep. Most folks called it rum hallucinations, but a few, the ones who'd heard the whispers on the tide, didn't laugh. The 30th of November came heavy with storm clouds and an unnatural wind. That night, the moon rose huge and red, staining the snow in the streets like fresh blood. The tide was higher than anyone had seen in years, churning against the cliffs in a way that didn't match the wind at all. Inside the Redgrave house, a single candle burned in the upstairs window. Neighbors swore they saw the girls' silhouettes moving back and forth as if pacing. Josiah sat alone at his table, sharpening his fishing knife with slow, deliberate strokes. Sometime near midnight, the candle went out. By dawn, the house was silent. The front door hung open, creaking in the wind. The snow on the threshold was marked by 2 sets of small bare footprints leading toward the cliffs. The search party found the nightgowns first, damp, stiff with frost and tangled in the rocks. Farther down, the footprints simply stopped. No broken ice, no drag marks, no sign they had slipped. But at the base of the cliff, the snow had been disturbed in a strange, long pattern, as if something large had pulled itself out of the water and then gone back in. That night, Josiah Redgrave locked his door and would not answer to anyone. The preacher came, pounding on the wood, calling his name. Through the thick oak came Josiah's voice, low and hoarse. "It's the price. You can't change the price once it's been set." No one knew what he meant. 2 days later, he was gone. His coat still hung by the door, his boots still by the bed. The snow outside showed 1 set of bare footprints, ending in the same place as his daughters. From that winter on, no one in Port Bell went to the cliffs after dark. But sometimes, on windless nights when the tide was high and the moon hung low, villagers swore they saw 2 small figures standing on the rocks. They would turn slowly as if searching for someone, and if you dared to listen closely, you might hear it again, the sea, whispering in a voice you almost recognized, calling you by name. In the weeks after the Redgrave vanishings, Port Bell moved like a wounded animal, restless, silent, and on edge. The fishermen still went out, but their eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, and their nets came in faster than before. Children were kept indoors after sundown. Even the chapel felt colder, as if the sea's damp breath had slipped inside. It was Mrs. Lowell, the midwife, who first spoke of the old names. She was a tiny, sharp-eyed woman whose family had lived in Port Bell since before the Revolution. She claimed there were places along the Maine coast where the water was older than God's light, and that things lived there that were not meant to be looked upon. She called them by names that made the listeners uneasy, words that rolled slow and wet from the tongue, like stones dragged through mud. One night, by the glow of the hearth, she told a group of women that the Redgrave girls' footprints had ended in the same place as another set, many years ago. In 1769, 2 brothers had gone missing during the last moon of November, and the snow that morning showed the same eerie pattern, bare feet leading to the cliff's edge, and that strange dragging mark near the rocks. The next day, Mrs. Lowell was found sitting by her window, eyes open, lips pale, her tea untouched. She never spoke again. Captain Elias Crane, a retired whaler, remembered hearing the whispers himself when he was a boy. His father had warned him never to answer, no matter what voice he heard. "It will sound like your mother," the old man had told him. "But it's the tide speaking, and the tide always lies." Crane said the sea sometimes called when the fog was thick, its voice thin and reedy, promising warmth, safety, and light. "That's how it gets you," he muttered, spitting into the fire. "That's how it got them." Some people began to notice other things. Dogs in the village had started to whine at night, staring toward the cliffs. Fish caught in the harbor came up pale-eyed and bloated, their scales peeling like wet paper, and the whispering sound, the one old Nathaniel had spoken about before his mind went, seemed louder now. Sometimes it came from the water, sometimes from the wind, but sometimes, people swore, it came from the snow itself, curling up through the still air like breath from a hidden mouth. 3 weeks after the sisters vanished, a young boy named Daniel Harrow swore he saw them in the fog. He was walking home from the harbor at dusk when the mist rolled in. Off the water and through it he saw 2 figures on the rocks. He said they were barefoot, their nightgowns clinging to them, dripping wet. They didn't shiver. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching him. When Daniel blinked, they were gone, but the wet footprints leading toward him were still there, fading slowly into the frost. By January, the stories had changed from speculation to warning. No one doubted that the Redgrave sisters were gone, but fewer still believed they were truly dead. They had been taken, the way the old names took people, drawn into the black beneath the waves, where no light or breath could follow. And yet, on some nights, villagers swore they saw 2 pale shapes far out on the water, moving against the current, their heads never dipping under the surface. They were always side by side, always facing the shore, always watching. By February, the storms had eased, but the fear in Port Bell had not. The snow had thinned to patches, the harbor ice had cracked and drifted away, yet people still locked their doors at sundown. No one lingered near the cliffs after dark, almost no one. Samuel Cotter was 17 and thought himself braver than most. He had worked the nets with his father since he was 9, and believed. Every story about the Redgrave sisters was just fear gone wild. The old names, the whispers, the footprints in the snow. It was nothing but a long winter making fools of the town. One evening, after a drink too many at the dockside tavern, Samuel decided to prove it. The moon was thin and white, the tide restless but not high. He told the men at the table he was going to stand on the Redgrave cliff for an hour, alone, and if the sea wanted him, it could come and take him. They laughed, but not all of them. Old Nathaniel Pike crossed himself. Samuel left just before midnight, the wind cutting at his cheeks, the snow crunching under his boots. The path to the cliff was narrow, lined with skeletal trees that scratched at the sky. When he reached the edge, he stood tall, hands in his coat pockets, and stared at the black churn of water below. At first there was nothing but the steady crash of the waves. Then slowly the air grew still. The sound of the water dulled, as if someone had placed thick cloth over his ears. And in that strange muffled quiet he heard it, a voice calling his name. It wasn't a shout, it was gentle, almost warm. It came from the sea, but it sounded exactly like his mother, the way she used to call him in for supper when he was a boy. He smiled, ready to laugh at how harmless it was. Then the voice spoke again, and it wasn't his mother anymore. Closer, the word was wet, stretched, like it had been pulled from something deep underwater. Samuel's smile faltered. He stepped back, but his feet slid forward instead, as if the ground had tilted toward the cliff. The air smelled of salt and rot, the kind that clings to dead fish left in the sun. Something moved in the water below. Pale, thin arms rose slowly from the dark, fingers long and limp. Hair floated around a head just beneath the surface. Samuel felt the weight of eyes on him, though he could not see a face. The voice came again, from the water and from behind him at the same time. "You're late." He didn't remember turning to run. The next thing he knew, he was back in the village, pounding on his father's door, his boots gone, his feet bare and raw with frostbite. He wouldn't speak of what happened, except to say that he had stood on the cliff for only a few minutes. But the men who found him swore his footprints had led all the way to the edge and never turned back. From that night on, Samuel never went near the water again, not the cliffs, not the harbor, not even the well. And sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, he would wake screaming, his throat raw, his voice hoarse from calling out for someone only he could see. March brought a strange warmth to Port Bell, but no comfort. The snow melted in the streets. The harbor was free of ice and gulls wheeled overhead. Again, yet the village still felt wrong, as if the air itself had thinned. The first sign came with the tide. One morning, the fishermen found their boats listing in the harbor, ropes torn free, water lapping over the decks. Not storm water. The sea itself had risen in the night, higher than it should, as if it had reached in to touch them. In the bilges, they found things that had no place on a human boat: long strands of black, slick hair, smooth white stones that pulsed faintly with warmth, and a smell like opened graves. That same week, Martha Pike's baby began waking in the middle of the night, screaming until his lips turned blue. She swore she could hear someone outside the window, calling to him in a soft, sing-song voice. When she looked out, there was nothing, only a faint trail of water leading away from the house and down toward the shore. 2 nights later, the thing happened that no one would speak of plainly. It was just before dawn when the sounds started. Not knocking, not scratching, but something heavier, dragging along the street outside. Those who dared look from their windows saw wet marks on the cobblestones, as though something huge had been pulled from the harbor and was moving slowly between the houses. It did not make a straight path. It stopped sometimes, turning toward a door or a shutter, and then moving on. At the Harrow house, it stopped for a long time. Daniel Harrow's mother later said she heard her son's voice outside, begging her to unlock the door. But Daniel had been in his bed, asleep, the whole time. She knew, because she'd held him down while he thrashed and tried to get up. He was cold to the touch, his lips moving as if whispering back to the thing outside. When the sun rose, the wet trail was gone, dried as if it had never been there. But the Harrow's threshold was covered in pale, fine sand, and a small bundle of white hair that matched the Redgrave sisters exactly. The next night, the sea came closer. People began to hear water dripping in their homes, though no bucket overflowed and no roof leaked. Sometimes it was in the hallway, sometimes just outside the bedroom door. Once it was found on the inside of a locked cupboard. The preacher called for a fast and prayer, saying the village must shut itself against the hunger of the tide. But hunger has patience, and everyone in Port Bell could feel it now, in the stillness before sleep, in the distant lull of the waves, in the faintest sound at the edge of hearing. It wasn't just calling anymore, it was looking. The night it happened, Port Bell was wrapped in a thick, rolling fog. You could barely see your own doorstep. The lanterns on the street looked like pale moons floating in the mist, their light swallowed after only a few feet. The fishermen stayed in, the tavern closed early, and even the dogs refused to bark. Inside her small home on the edge of the village, Ruth Calder sat in her rocking chair, knitting by the fire. She lived alone since her husband's death at sea the previous winter. But she was no stranger to the sound of waves or wind. That night, however, she heard something else, a slow, wet tapping on the back door. She thought it might be the wind moving a loose shutter. She didn't get up at first. But then the tapping came again, heavier this time, and between the taps there was breathing. Not the kind of breath that comes from a human chest. It was long, drawn out and strange, like air moving through a hollow shell. When Ruth finally stood and walked toward the door, she called out, "Who's there?" No answer came, only another slow tap, and then something soft brushing the wood. Her hand was on the latch when she heard a whisper. It was faint, but close, so close it might have been right behind the door. "Ruth." She froze. It was her husband's voice. Every part of her knew it couldn't be, yet her heart surged as if it were true. "Daniel?" she whispered back. The voice came again, quieter. "Come with me. It's so warm here." Her eyes filled with tears. Without thinking, she began to lift the latch. That's when the front door burst open. Elias Pike, the preacher's son, had been making his rounds to check on the older folk during the fog. He saw Ruth standing in the back doorway, the latch half lifted, and something, dark and wet, pressing against the seam where the wood met the frame. He couldn't see what it was in the dim light, but it shimmered like oil on water. "Don't open it," Elias shouted, crossing the room in 3 strides. He grabbed her shoulder and yanked her away, but he was too late. The door flew inward with a force that cracked the hinges. Something poured in. Not a man, not an animal, but a shape of water and shadow, its edges writhing. From within it, pale, human faces surfaced and sank again, mouths moving soundlessly. The smell was overpowering, salt, rot, and something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. The thing surged forward, wrapping around Ruth like a living tide. She screamed once, and then she was gone, pulled into the center of that darkness. Elias swore her face changed as it vanished, not twisted in fear, but strangely calm, almost smiling. The creature slid back out the door as quickly as it had entered, leaving only puddles behind that steamed in the cool air. By the time the others arrived, Ruth's house was empty. That night, no one slept. They bolted their doors and kept lanterns burning until dawn, but all knew it was useless. The sea had found its way inside, and once it took one, it would take more. Some whispered that Ruth was the first, but she wouldn't be the last, and they were right. It began with a smell, not the usual briny breath of the Atlantic, but something heavier, like seaweed rotting. In the sun, mixed with the faint sweetness of something that had been dead too long. It was the kind of smell that clung to your clothes, crawled into your hair, and stayed there. By the time the villagers noticed it, the wind had already shifted. Around dusk, the horizon where the sea met the sky blurred, the sharp line melting into a smear of dull gray. The air thickened, pressing against the skin like damp cloth. The fog came quietly at first, curling in thin ribbons between the crooked houses. Then it grew bold, rolling over fences, swallowing the street lamps and blotting out the cliff edge. By nightfall, Port Bell had disappeared from the world it knew. The streets were gone. The sea was gone. There was only the black fog. People stayed inside, doors locked, windows barred. The old ones, those who remembered the whispers of 1802, kept their candles unlit. Firelight, they said, could be seen through fog, and firelight could call things to you. But curiosity is a predator, and predators wait. The first knock came around midnight. It was gentle, almost polite, at the door of Mrs. Calder's cottage. She sat frozen in her chair by the stove, her hand wrapped tight around the poker. She hadn't lit the fire. She hadn't even moved in hours, just listening to the distant moan of the foghorn. Except there was no foghorn in Port Bell. The knock came again, a slow 3-beat rhythm, then a pause, then the sound of a wet palm sliding down the wood, and then her name, Ruth. It was her son's voice, the one she had buried 2 winters ago. She didn't move. Her heart thudded against her ribs. Every instinct screamed to open the door. But something in the tone, something wrong in the way the syllable stretched, froze her in place. She did not open the door. Others weren't as strong. Around the corner, Thomas Bellamy was already stepping onto his porch, lantern in hand. He had heard his wife calling from the road. She'd been dead nearly a decade, taken by the fever that winter. But her voice had been so clear, so alive, floating through the fog. He called her name. Something answered. It sounded like her, but not quite. The words were slurred as though spoken underwater. His lantern sputtered and went out in a cold breath of air. Neighbors later said they heard the boards of his porch creak once, then silence. Thomas Bellamy didn't come back inside. By 2 a.m, the voices were everywhere. They floated through the streets, some whispering, some singing in slow, drawn-out notes that made the glass in the windows hum. Children cried in their beds. Dogs hid under tables and whimpered. Through the shifting walls of fog, shapes began to appear, tall, human-like shadows, bending wrong at the joints, moving with a slow, patient glide. They didn't hurry. They didn't need to. They paused at corners. They tilted their heads toward shuttered windows, as if listening. In the small boarding house near the harbor, Eliza Murrin peeked through a crack in her curtain. At first, she thought the shape in the street was just a neighbor, lost in the fog. Then it turned its head toward her, slowly, unnaturally. The skin around her eyes prickled. She shut the curtain, but she could still see the afterimage burned into her vision. Tall, thin, with a face that looked like wax melted by heat, features sagging. And the smell. God, the smell. Somewhere near the church, Jonah Price had a different problem. He'd been outside when the fog closed in. He'd gone to check his lobster traps by lantern light, not thinking much of it until he realized he could no longer see the water. The shore was gone. The world had become nothing but wet black air and the faint glow of his own light. Then the light caught something ahead, a pale hand, hanging in the fog like it had no arm attached. It moved toward him, smooth and steady, as though pulled on an invisible string. Jonah dropped his lantern and ran. Back in the village, the fog began to hum, not the voices, not the wind. The fog itself. It was a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, crawling into the bones. People clutched their heads, their ears. Some swore they saw faces forming in the mist, faces they recognized, loved ones, neighbors. The dead. One young boy claimed he saw the Redgrave sisters standing in the street, hands clasped, smiling through the fog. He said their eyes were black, and their feet didn't touch the ground. By dawn, the fog began to peel back from the rooftops like a slow tide. The village reappeared in pieces, chimneys first, then rooftops, then the dark, wet streets. That's when they saw the footprints, dozens of them, bare, wet, leading from doorsteps toward the cliff. The snow hadn't melted yet, and the prints were dark with seawater. Of the people who had followed the voices into the fog that night, only one was found. Samuel Pratt washed up on the rocks at low tide, eyes wide open, skin pale as candle wax. His lungs were full of salt water, but there was no water in his mouth. His lips were curved in a faint smile. He did not speak for the 3 days he lived after being found, except to hum softly under his breath. The tune was slow, deep, and everyone who heard it felt the same thing, like something was still moving in the fog, waiting for another night to return. The fog had gone. The smell hadn't. Even with the sky scraped clean and the sun spilling over Port Bell, the air clung with that briny rot, as if something had crawled out of the ocean and died in the middle of the street. The villagers tried to make sense of it in the daylight, but talking about the night was like pulling thread from a rotten cloth. Once you started, too much came loose. Nobody wanted to admit they'd heard voices. Nobody wanted to admit they'd nearly opened their doors. But the footprints, those couldn't be ignored. They led all through town, across porches, over fences, and in more than one case, through locked gates. They always ended the same way, at the cliff edge, where the black stone dropped into the Atlantic. Sheriff Weller stood at one such edge that morning, staring down at the crashing water. The wind tossed spray high enough to dampen his coat, but it was what lay below that unsettled him. Seaweed, not just tangled on the rocks, but caught in the cliff face itself, like something had scraped up against it from below, something big. That afternoon the whispers started again, not out loud. This time, it was in the telling. People swore they'd seen shapes in the fog, shapes that matched names from the village cemetery, and more than one person claimed to have seen the Redgrave sisters. Eliza Redgrave, Marie Redgrave. The two girls who drowned in 1802 when the old whaling ship Petrel went down in a squall just off the coast. They were young, 12 and 14, and the story went that their mother had lit a lantern in the window every night for a year, waiting for them to come home. When she died, they buried her with that lantern in her hands. And here's the part nobody liked to say out loud. The sisters had been seen before, once in 1,834, once in 1,871, and now, each time the fog had come first. The Reverend brought it up at Sunday service, though his voice was thin and nervous. He spoke about temptation, about how the devil could use the faces of half the pews were empty. Of those who came, most sat with their coats still on, glancing toward the windows. The fog was gone, yes, but everyone noticed the tide. It was higher than it should have been. Even at low tide, the waves licked almost to the base of the cliff. 3 days later, Jonah Price, who had seen that pale hand in the fog, vanished. His boat was found adrift at dawn, the nets torn like something had pulled them from below. In the center of the deck sat a single thing, a child's shoe, soaked in seawater. The shoe was too small to be Jonah's, and no child in Port Bell was missing. That same evening, old Mrs. Calder heard the knocking again. She didn't answer, but she swore she saw 2 small shadows pressed against her window. When she opened her eyes the next morning, there were wet handprints on the glass, thin, delicate, like a child's. By the following week, the sea had turned strange. It wasn't just the tide anymore. Fishermen reported patches of water that were black as ink, even in full sun. Nets came up heavy with fish that were bloated and pale, eyes wide, mouths open as if screaming. One morning, a mass of seaweed washed ashore near the harbor. The tangle was thick, almost the size of a man, and threaded inside it were things that made the stomach turn. Buttons, bits of cloth, a rusted hairpin. Sheriff Weller recognized the hairpin immediately. It had belonged to Eliza Redgrave. That night the voices returned, not in fog, but riding on the wind. They called from the cliffs, weaving between the crash of the waves, always in pairs, always young, always laughing in that slow, deliberate way children do when they know something you don't. A few villagers went out to listen. They didn't come back. By now, no one doubted the sisters had come back from the sea. The question wasn't if they would take more, but why. Eliza Murrin, who had seen the wax-faced figure in the fog, claimed to know. She said she'd been reading the old shipping logs from 1802. The fog had gone. The smell hadn't. Even with the sky scraped clean and the sun spilling over Port Bell, the air clung with that briny rot, as if something had crawled out of the ocean and died in the middle of the street. The villagers tried to make sense of it in the daylight, but talking about the night was like pulling thread from a rotten cloth. Once you started, too much came loose. Nobody wanted to admit they'd heard voices. Nobody wanted to admit they'd nearly opened their doors. But the footprints, those couldn't be ignored. They led all through town, across porches, over fences, and in more than one case, through locked gates. They always ended the same way, at the cliff edge, where the black stone dropped into the Atlantic. Sheriff Weller stood at one such edge that morning, staring down at the crashing water. The wind tossed spray high enough to dampen his coat, but it was what lay below that unsettled him. Seaweed, not just tangled on the rocks, but caught in the cliff face itself, like something had scraped up against it from below, something big. That afternoon the whispers started again, not out loud. This time, it was in the telling. People swore they'd seen shapes in the fog, shapes that matched names from the village cemetery, and more than one person claimed to have seen the Redgrave sisters. Eliza Redgrave, Marie Redgrave, the 2 girls who drowned in 1802 when the old whaling ship Petrel went down in a squall just off the coast. They were young, 12 and 14, and the story went that their mother had lit a lantern in the window every night for a year, waiting for them to come home. When she died, they buried her with that lantern in her hands. And here's the part nobody liked to say out loud. The sisters had been seen before, once in 1,834, once in 1,871, and now, each time the fog had come first. The Reverend brought it up at Sunday service, though his voice was thin and nervous. He spoke about temptation, about how the devil could use the faces of the night it happened. The sea was loud. not the usual crash and retreat of waves, but a heavy, constant sound, like 1,000 barrels being rolled across the shore at once. It made the windows hum. People tried to sleep, but nobody really could. They sat in their beds or at their kitchen tables, hands wrapped around, mugs gone cold, staring at the dark corners of their rooms. And then the smell came. Not fish, not salt, not even rot. It was older than that, deeper, like the inside of something that had never been touched by air until now. The first to see them was Mrs. Calder. She had been sitting in her chair by the window, knitting without looking, when she noticed movement at the cliff's edge. The moon was fat and white, the kind of moon that lights the ocean like glass. 2 girls stood there, white dresses, wet hair hanging in ropes. Even from her window, she could see the way the fabric clung to them, like a second skin, and the way their faces didn't quite match. The eyes were too wide, the mouths too still. The Redgrave sisters. They didn't move for a long time, just stood, holding hands, looking at the town, and then, as if they had all the time in the world, they started walking. Down the main street, past the shuttered bakery, past the boarded schoolhouse. Their bare feet left no sound, but the street darkened behind them, as if the light itself was sinking into the ground. People who saw them from upstairs windows found they couldn't move away. Something in their gaze held you, like a hook in the back of the skull. The sea came with them. By the time they reached the harbor, the water was already spilling over the docks, crawling into the alleys like a living thing. In it floated pieces of the deep, seaweed that pulsed like lungs, fish with teeth too human, shells that opened and closed as if tasting the air. And behind all of that, shapes, large shapes, moving just under the surface. Sheriff Weller tried to stop them. He stood in the street, shotgun in hand, his boots already ankle-deep in seawater. "Go back," he shouted, though his voice was swallowed almost instantly by the sound of the tide. The sisters stopped. Eliza tilted her head. Marie smiled, a slow, thin curve that showed no teeth. Then they stepped forward, and the water surged, knocking Weller to his knees. By the time he stood again, they were past him. The shotgun was gone from his hands, pulled under by something he never saw. Doors began to open. It was the voices, soft, sweet, the kind you lean into without meaning to. Every house they passed, a door would swing open, and someone would step out, barefoot, eyes glassy. They'd join the slow procession, walking with the water toward the cliffs. Old men, children, women clutching their nightgowns. One by one they stepped into the sea. None came back. Eliza Murren, who had warned everyone, was one of the last left on land. She clung to the bell rope in the church, ringing it so hard the skin on her palms split. The sound carried far into the night, but the sisters didn't look back. When the water reached the church steps, Eliza let go. She ran for the belfry, climbing until she could see the whole town drowning below. The sea was everywhere now. In the moonlight, she saw the shapes under the surface more clearly. Long arms, jointed wrong. Spines that curled and uncurled. Mouths, too many mouths, opening in silent hunger. The sisters walked straight into the black water. The others followed. The shapes welcomed them. By dawn, the tide had gone out. The streets were empty. Houses stood with their doors wide. Nets and boats drifted in the harbor, abandoned. And on the cliff, the lantern Mrs. Redgrave had once lit for her daughters lay in the grass, still burning with a steady, pale flame. The wind shifted, carrying a sound from far out at sea. 2 young voices, laughing. And then, just for a moment, a hand broke the surface of the water. It waved. If you think the tide is only water, think again. The Redgrave sisters' story is one of many whispered along Maine's coast. And some say they still walk the cliffs when the moon is high. But tell me, would you dare to stand there and see for yourself? If this story sent a shiver down your spine, make sure you subscribe to Behind, the genius for more true and terrifying tales that history tried to bury. And if you've heard of another place where the sea keeps its dead, leave it in the comments, because next time, it might be your town we're talking about.